everybody. Thank you very much for joining us here today at 9.Connects. You are in the right place if you are here for our webinar on DRC Revisited. So what I'd like to do before we continue here is I'd like to go through some of our objectives. As you may have seen in yesterday's announcement, we decided that we're going to split this into a two-part series. I was reviewing the presentation I did about 6.5 years ago, and I realized that I was already speaking a mile a minute during that presentation, and with everything that Altium has added since then, I would have to even speak even faster to try to get that under an hour. So rather than do that, I'd like to take our sweet time and break it up into two sections. The first, what we're going to do here today is we're going to talk about the purpose of the rules. I think that's really important, and we'll explain that here as we go along. And secondly, we'll look at Altium's functionality, such as the display control, or how do we determine the error that we're seeing in front of us. In the next webinar, which we're going to slate for August, we will talk about classes, we'll talk about the methods of creating the rules, the regional rules, special case rules, and I did get a couple of them from some of the people attending here today, and I really appreciate that. And if you do come across some unusual or strange situations, I'd certainly like to know about them, and I'll be more than happy to consider those for the August webinar as well. So that's how we're going to split this up here today. So before, one other thing I'm going to mention is we certainly will have some time for questions. Feel free to write those into your questions panel. And if the folks that are assisting me with this presentation today do not answer it, I'll try to answer it at the end of the presentation. With that being said, we do have a question for you here. We'll get our first polling question going. I'd like to know if you have already moved to Altium Designer 18 or 19. All right, very good, thank you. So it looks like a huge portion of the crowd has definitely moved over to it, so it's 84%, and I know that there are a lot of holdouts. It definitely was a major revision change, so I can see why there's some hesitation. And of course, if you work in a very large organization, and I one time worked at one myself, I know that it takes a while for the company to move forward to the latest and greatest. So, but this is great. So we're going to continue to move on over here, and there we go. So to start off our conversation, I'd like to ask another polling question, and that is, there are 62 DRC rules in Altium Designer. I'd like to know what you think is the number of them that are turned on by default. So take a guess at how many of those 62 rules are actually turned on every time you create a new PCB dock. So if I can get a drum roll over here, the correct answer, believe it or not, is B, 50%. Okay, or in this case over here, and sorry for the polling question here, it's a little bit out of sync of my slide. It was C, 50%. So about a quarter of you got it correct. So believe it or not, out of the 62 rules that Altium has available, only 50% of them, literally 31 of them, are actually enabled in Altium Designer. And we'll see that as we go along here today. So I'm going to show you a few more PowerPoint slides, and then we're going to definitely jump into the tool itself. But I think it's important for us to understand the purpose of the rules. And there's really 4 reasons to have rules in Altium Designer. Now, of course, most of us immediately think of, well, we need this for manufacturing. We've got to give the fabricator and the assembler the right stuff so that they can actually fabricate this and we can avoid respins. And that's certainly the primary reason. So to make the board manufacturable, the best example of that is our clearance rule, right? If we don't adhere to the clearance rules, then they may not be able to manufacture the board. The other reason is for, and I clump these all together, though they really are somewhat separate, high-speed / signal integrity purposes. So in high-speed design, you can create copper all you want. However, just because you created the copper and they can manufacture the copper doesn't mean that it's good copper for high-speed signaling. And then, of course, there's also a tool in Altium Designer called signal integrity. And there are a set of rules that actually adhere specifically to the signal integrity setup as well. So I lump those all together here as another reason. The third reason is what I'll call tool response. And a lot of times you look at the rule and say, why would I need that? And you're right, you probably don't need it, and you'll always pass it. However, a lot of times the tool needs some guidance as to how it's going to respond. A great example of that is going to be a polygon pour. When you pour a polygon, you're going to expect it to pull back based on the clearance rule, based on your your polygon connect rule, or any other type of rule, for example, and just beyond the polygon rule, but those rules that require you to remove negative copper. You add voids into the negative copper, like a plane rule. So those are the type of what I'll call tool response rules that you've got to have up, because if you didn't have them there, you'll get some really weird or unusual events that will happen within the layout tool. And the last one is for auto routing, and I'll talk about a few examples of that here in a few minutes. But what I call the common sense things that we would do as humans, you actually have to dictate those to the auto router. So for example, you may not want to route on a certain layer because maybe you want to hold off something on that layer. Well, in the auto router, it's going to use whatever layers are available. So you got to actually have to tell it which layers you can and cannot use. So those are the 4 reasons right there. So before we jump into Altium Designer and I give you the grand tour, what I'd like to get from you as another polling question is, when you start a design, how do you start your rule sets? All right, so we've got our results over here. So almost 50% of you are using some form of company template, and that's really great. And then another large portion of you are certainly using just your prior experience to build those from scratch. And hopefully after today, I can show you a few ways to at least have something that you could start from rather than having to go in and change each and every individual rules. Those who are using from the fabricator, kudos to you, because they're the ones who are obviously going to be able to dictate to you what the best recommendations are for some of those rules. And for the 2% rebels out there, all the power to you. So who needs rules, right? All right, let me push this off. We'll talk about this question at the end. So let's jump into Altium Designer and take our tour. So we have up here our board. This is our latest and greatest creation here at 9.connect. It's called the Neo 9. And it's another board that we've been developing to keep our skills sharp here. So the Neo 9 board is what we're going to focus on here today. And what we're going to start off with here are the design rules themselves. So very quick recap, where do we get them? We obviously go into the design menu, and then we go into rules. And of course, if you want the shortcut, you can use DR, and we bring up the rule set. So what I want to spend a few moments on is just talking about the categories that you see here, and I'm actually going to work bottom up. So the first set of rules are the signal integrity rules. And what are these rules? Well, these rules are used for the signal integrity tool. And you can certainly take a look at a prior webinar that we've done on this, and that webinar was done several years ago, but Altium has not put what I consider to be any major work into the signal integrity tool system. Keep in mind, it's still equation-based, where the better simulation systems out there are going to be the 3D, what they call 3D field solving model type things, like the ones you'd find in, for example, Hyperlinks or in Cadence's signal integrity tool. And as a matter of fact, we've done webinars on that very recently if you'd like to know more information about that. My understanding is that Altium has obtained somebody who is good at that 3D field solving type of capability, so we may see some changes with that in the near future. But the short of it is that if you're going to run the signal integrity tools in Altium, these would be the things that you would turn on so you can get results of them. But by default, they are turned off. So if you don't see a little chevron over here to turn things on and off here, that means that there's no rules. So there's no little, it's really an arrow. So the little arrow over here, there's none, because none of these rules have been turned on. I'll show you how to create a new rule in just a moment, which takes us to the next group. This is placement. So in the placement, you'll see that there are 2 of these that are turned on by default, possibly a third one if we actually had a room. And I'll talk about that one in just a moment. But the important rule here is the component clearance rule. This is one of the most powerful features of Altium because it can handle things that are not only adjacent to each other, but can also allow you to test for things that are hitting against an enclosure or a chassis if you happen to bring them in to the tool as well. And of course, there's the height rule. The room definition is something we'll talk about in the next webinar. This happens to deal with what I call a regional rule, in which you want to have a specific situation only in one part of the board, but for the rest of the board, you want another set of rules. So you can use those room definitions. And again, I'll talk about it next time. Now, what about some of these other things that they have over here? So Altium makes them available. Do you have to use them? You may or may not, but again, think of why you might want to use them. In some cases, you may just say, well, this is just common sense. I don't really need to have this. But if you want to turn them on, it's not a problem. You simply select the category and you press new rule, and it will bring up the new rule up here. So let's double click into this. One of the powerful features about Altium is that they do try to give you some type of picture. Not every single time, but for the most part, they'll give you a picture if it's not going to be obvious as to what the rule is trying to address. So that's what you can do here. So if you want to have For example, a required orientation of all of your parts. And in some cases, for some older assembly processes, you may want to do this when they're doing the wave soldering. That's a viable option for you to have here. So that's an example of starting up a rule and taking a look at what the rules got available to you. The next set of them are the high-speed rules. We have done a webinar on this, I think about 3 to 4 years ago, on pretty much all of these. It looks as though I think 2 more rules have been added to this list since we did that webinar. But if you want to understand what each one of these are doing, then definitely take a look at that webinar. We explain what they're trying to address in high-speed design. A lot of times it's either to try to avoid some type of noise situation or an accidental antenna. So that's something to take a look at here. But again, none of these are turned on by default. The manufacturing does exactly what you think it should do. These are the manufacturing rules. Pretty much all of them are turned on with the exception of acute angle or minimum annular ring. So you can just take a look at those and see which ones you'd want to make sure we're all set accordingly. Altium generally does adhere to what I'll call the standards, but of course standards keep changing as everything gets a little bit smaller. Things like the acute angle, again, I'll just create the rule just so you can take a look at over here. If you happen to be using older equipment or you're really concerned about acid traps, there's always a debate as to whether or not that's still an issue or not. I tend to believe that a lot of the fabricators are probably fixing these things for you behind the scenes. So just be aware that what you gave to the fabricator and what you're actually getting may be slightly different. But if you are concerned about this or you're using older equipment, then these are things you may want to turn on to avoid those situations. But take a look at those manufacturing rules there. They are literally there for manufacturing purposes. The next set are the test points, and the test points are there to assist in fabrication and assembly and even test. But the idea is that they can run continuity. So after you run the board, one of the checks that they can do is they can do continuity, usually with flying probes, and they can see if you got opens or shorts on your boards. If you can give them where they can put the probes, all the better, especially for the test folks who usually have to perform minor miracles on those boards in order to find a place to probe, especially with today's BGAs. The next two, plane and mask, to me, these are a great example of the things that you do on the tool or to let the tool do what it needs to do to get things done. So you're either controlling a layer or you're controlling, in this case, a polygon pour, and you're trying to dictate to it, look, in these circumstances, do this for all of these type of objects, so you're not doing them so you're not having to do that for yourself. I mean, imagine doing, some 20-layer board and you're putting in all the voids for some type of via, or you're handling all the thermal spokes for each and every single via that you put through the board. That would take forever. So as long as these are turned on, then Altium will be able to do that for you. The SMT rules that you see up here are not turned on, and these are what I'll again call like common sense things that we would just probably do just because of aesthetic reasons or just because it'll look weird if we just didn't do it. But again, if you're going to try to use the auto router, then you may want to specifically tell it, saying, for example, hey, look, if you leave this pad over here, I don't want you to immediately jog off hard to the right or to the left. I want you to give a little bit of a space before you start jogging out to another direction. So that's what the SMT category is all about. Under the routing category, the two big ones are always your width and your routing vias. Of course, the width rule for impedances and or fabrication tolerances, and the routing vias are going to be there so that you can manage the board sizes. So again, if you're going to work with your fabricator, make sure that your routing vias are small enough so that you have the real estate to work with, but big enough so that they can actually not only drill and plate it, but also that the drill has a good target to hit. The next one over here, if you didn't catch that, let me just repeat it again. For the routing vias, make sure that you make them small enough so that they are, so that they give you the real estate necessary to route, but large enough so that they can drill and plate it and that the drill has a good target to hit. The next one is the width. So here in the width rule is, again, the one that's probably the most important for the purposes of impedances, but again, also something that's large enough so that it can be fabricated, but small enough so that you have the real estate to actually do the routing in it. And of course, the electrical, the most common probably of all the rules that everybody uses and probably causes the most consternation for people are the clearance rules. So the clearance rules are super important as well. And you may have noticed over time that Altium has changed this, which I think is kind of neat. So in the past, if you were trying to create what I would call a clearance between two different copper primitives, you would have had to create a very separate rule in order to do that. And now over here, if you leave it as an all rule, then you can just simply define the differences between those type of copper clearanced primitives, and rather than having to create them separately. So that's, I think, a really useful way of handling this over here. One of the other ones I'll show you, just because it's something we'll talk about in the next webinar, but it's really important as well, is that obviously you can have multiple rules for under a given category. So under fan out control, they actually give you that situation. So what they've done over here is they've given very specific rules for certain things, and then they have a catch-all rule down here. So if it doesn't fall under any one of these categories, it falls under the default rule. So when Altium's going through and it's trying to do its DRC check or is doing a batch check, every single primitive is going to be evaluated for a given rule, and it's going to see if it is associated for each one, and it keeps dropping down the list, and eventually it should get to what I'll call the catch-all rule, the all rule. The point I want to make here for this is that you should always have a catch-all rule. If you don't, then again, Altium could go off and it'll do some really weird things. Many years ago, I remember somebody came to us and they said, look, I do a polygon pour and I'm getting a Picasso drawing because it's all over the place. What's going on? Well, sure enough, they had blown away their default all clearance rule, and so they didn't have some catch-all for some of the situations, and so the polygon pour is going all over the place. So just keep those in mind over here. Another thing just to mention for you, there is a difference between some of these rules. It's called binary versus unary. So in a binary situation, you have two different objects that you are comparing against. The clearance rule is the best example of that. So you have to have two different things so that it can take a measurement to determine if it's passing or failing. And you'll usually see a first object match and you'll see a second object match. So that's the idea behind a binary. As opposed to a unary rule where it is the primitive itself that's being evaluated. So if I'm going down a trace and I want a certain width of that trace, then that's going to be a unary rule there. The next thing I want to show you here, because I think a lot of people actually make a big mistake when they try to do this, and it's not obvious, and that's when you're trying to import or you're trying to export rules. So to import or export, it's a matter of right-clicking on any one of the major categories. Now, because I've made a few changes here, there's some pending changes, it won't allow me to do this. So I'm going to cancel out here, and then I'm going to go back in to design rules. And now that I'm back to where I've originally started, I can right-click and I can say export rules. Where the mistake is that everyone forgets to select all the other categories in here. So if you pressed OK at this moment, the only thing you'll save off is your clearance constraint. So if we want the other ones, we do have to scroll down and hold down our Shift key, and we'll select them all and we'll press OK. From there, it's going to ask us where to save the .rul file. So let's put that in a location. I'm just going to put it in my downloads for now, and I'll press save. And of course, through my prior runs of this, we've already got one in there, so I'll just stomp on it. Later on, when you want to bring it in, you'll just right-click and import rules. So you can bring these into any other PCB docs that you've got. Just be forewarned that if you had specific nets in there, those nets are going to come in there as well. And for the most part, Altium's going to ignore them, especially if those nets simply just don't exist, because it'll look and say, well, I don't have that net name, so I'm just going to move on to the next rule. So just be aware of that. When I import the rule, I got to do the same thing, because otherwise, if I just press OK, even if I exported all the rules, the only thing I'll get if I press OK over here is just the clearance constraint rule. And I want to grab everything. So again, I'm going to scroll down, hold down my Shift key and press OK. It's going to ask me where it's at, and click on it, press open. And then it's going to ask me if I want to change these rules, and I'll say yes, and it'll go through and it will basically introduce those rules into my rule set here. Okay. So hopefully this gives you an idea of the PCB rules and constraints from a general point of view. Again, in the next webinar, we'll definitely get into some of the key rules and things that you would want to know about those here. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually press OK here, because I did introduce some errors into this board. And you can see that now we do have our infamous lime green, and we'll talk about that here now. So what if I don't want to deal with the error markers at the moment? Well, there's two ways to do it. One of them is to go into Tools, and I can go into Reset Error Markers. And if I do that, boom, it's cleared out and I'm good to go. So that's one way to do it. However, if I do go back into Design Rules and I make changes, every time I press OK, Altium's going to perform an online DRC, and those green thing, the lime green error markers are going to show up again if I still have those violations based on my rule set. So just keep that in mind. What about turning it off? You can do it, but I would tell you to do so in with much caution. So to turn off the online DRC, you can go to the top right corner where the cog is. So for those who are not familiar with this, in Altium 18 and 19, the preferences have been moved from the old DXP menu, which is no longer in Altium 1819, and they put it under a cog. So I am now in the preferences. I'm going to go under PCB editor and under general. And the very first thing they give you the option to do is turn off the online DRC. Here's my point on this. If you are starting a board from the ground up, please leave it on. I've seen a lot of people turn this thing off, and then later on, after you've done some heavy routing, they turn this thing on, they realize they really painted themselves in a corner, because it's tough to fix some of those online DRCs after the fact. So if you're starting a board from scratch, please leave it on. I think you do yourself a big service. However, if you're importing stuff from another tool, or you're trying to reverse engineer a board from Gerber's into the PCB dock, then you may want to turn this off initially, because it can get a little bit overwhelming. And of course, as you're trying to fix rules, then the online DRC may be of some value to you. So that's my 2 cents worth on it. But yeah, if you turn this off, then the online DRC will be disabled. So that's the other thing we want to make mention of over here. So the one thing I do want to mention, and this is kind of why it's important to leave the online DRC, is because when you're interacting with the tool, the online DRC is there to help you. Because how kind of crummy would it be if you started something, you finish it, and then it says, yeah, by the way, that's wrong. I'd rather have it flag it or prevent me from doing it from the beginning. And we've all seen this, especially when we route. So if I zoom in here and I start a route, and I want to bring this route right through here, it's not going to allow me to do it. Now, there are ways for me to hit the tab key and go into the options and say ignore obstacles, and it will allow me to blow through, and it will create the error. But by default, it's not going to let me do that, which is kind of a nice thing. So notice how close it allows me to get here, right? It's not going to allow me to get any closer than what the rule is that's defined for clearances. So now again, you can see that these rules are there to not only prevent me from, well, not only to flag those things I have made mistakes on, but prevent me from making new mistakes. So just kind of keep that in mind there. Okay. The other thing I'm going to show you is a feature up here in the tools called the design rule check. So there are 2 types of rule runs that we can do. What we've seen are the online DRCs, but the other one we can do is what I'll call batch. And what we do here, and again, I'll just show you, to get that batch going, you can go into the tools, into design rule check. And there's 2 basic options here. The first one is just how do you want it to be presented to you? And I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, I've probably never really changed anything here except for the stop when X number of violations are found. So if you are bringing in a board from another company, from another EDA tool, and the rules didn't come in with it, Altium's going to default to its rules, and you may get a whole bunch of errors here. And sometimes it's just a little bit easier to say, hey, look, 500, I've got so many here, I need to see if I got more of them. And you can set this up to 9,999 based on all the testing I've done on it in the past. So that may be something to do, again, if you brought something in from another tool and the rules need to be reestablished for it. What about rules to check? So notice that all these categories are here. There's the online and there are the batch. So the online, again, are those things that are going to be done either when you close out the rule check, when you go into the rules and you press OK, and it'll do an online DRC, or when you're in the middle of trying to do something like a route or you're moving a component. That's what they mean by the online. The other ones are for the batch, and that can be run here in this dialog. However, if you press OK, it won't run it. So this is a little tricky here. It drives me crazy because I always forget that the button's actually on the right side. So if we go into design rule check, and it doesn't matter which one of these tabs I'm on here, in order to run it, you've got to hit this button over here, design rule check. By the way, one thing to note, that these are set up specific to the PCB dock. They are not set up in the preferences. There are some preferences that we can set up, but they're more for visual as opposed to whether you're turning them on and off within the layout. So these have to be turned on and off within this dialog specific to this PCB dock. Okay. So if I want to run this, I can. I do have to click Run the design rule check here. And two things should happen. You should get the message panel, and you ought to also get this HTML report here. Both of them are extremely useful. So this is really useful to look at here because you can try to give a little bit of priority to those things that seem to have the most issues with them. And one thing I have found is that if you start tackling the big ones first, a lot of times these other issues will go away along with it. So for example, one of the things I did was I actually deleted a little trace so that I could show what it looked like for an unrouted net constraint. So I did fail that, but guess what? I left this trace segment in there, so there's also a net antenna. But if I fix this, I'm probably going to fix the net antenna as well. So those are the kind of things that kind of go away as you fix the larger issues moving along here. If you click on any one of these categories here, the violations, it'll bring you down and it'll show you the very specific things that are going on. And it does give a lot of information. So it'll tell you what the issue was, it'll tell you why it failed, and it will tell you what two primitives it failed on. Now, if this doesn't make a lot of sense to you, that's not a problem. You can basically click on it and it'll jump you in to the area on the board. Now, you can split the screen if you want. You can go between the design verification report and the PCB doc. The information is also here as well in the message panel, so you can double click on any one of these and it will bring you there as well. So there's a couple of ways that you can use to jump around to see where you have your violations. A last area that you can look at, but you got to keep your cursor a little bit still on this, is if you put your cursor on the violation, you'll notice that the heads up display, and that's the thing in the top left corner of my layout area, says clearance constraint, and it shows the amount at 7.015 mils is less than 15 mils between track on top layer and pad on top layer. So that's another way for me to get a quick visualization what's going on. But of course, I can't move my cursor, otherwise the heads-up display will move. Now, there are ways in the preferences to lock this down a little bit more, so you can tell it what things you want to always show or what things can pop up once you stop your cursor. The only problem I've ever found with that is that if you try to set some of these things, it just takes up a big amount of real estate and it becomes a little bit of an eyesore. And I like to have as much real estate as I can when I'm trying to work in the layout tool. Okay. Now that we're over here, I'd like to talk about some of the features that Altium has added when we are looking at the layout region of the PCB dock here. In the past, if you got errors, it looked like this. And if you zoomed in, it looked like this. And if you still want to look like this when you zoom in, there's ways to do that, and I'll talk about that here as well. But what they've added in over time are two features. One of the biggest complaints people had was they said, look, it's great that you're flagging this as being an error, but I've got 20 layers and I really can't even tell which layer the error is on because this green stuff is just blocking everything. Now in this case here, I got a 2-layer board, so it's not really a big issue, but when I've got a lot of layers, it really becomes a big issue. So what they decided to do is they said, okay, we'll put a pattern over here so that yes, you can tell it's violating, but you can still tell the color of the layer that it's on. And so that's a really nice thing that they had added in some time ago. The other feature they've been adding in is that for the rules that are violating, they try to give you a little more detail as to what's being violated, because a lot of the complaints people came back to is like, well, I see you're flagging it, I don't know what it's flagging it for. And they did have some tools, which I'll show you in a few minutes, but what they wanted to do is they wanted a faster way of visualizing what the error was. So what they did was they created what we call the display overlays here. So you can see, for example, and I'm zooming this in really far so you can see it, if you have two arrows pointing to each other, it's showing a clearance rule, and in this case, they even tell you what you violated. And in this particular instance, I violated the fact that I am less than 15 mils. Over here, as I said, I deleted this just to kind of show that, but I have an antenna that's complaining about, and I now have broken this wire, so now it's complaining about an open for this particular net. So those are the kind of things that we are seeing over here. Now, as I mentioned, you can control this. If you want to control the way this looks, you can do that, and that can be done in the preferences. So I'm going to bring up the preferences right now. So I'm going to click again on the little cog here, and I'm going to go into DRC violations display. And I encourage you to play with this a little bit. It's kind of interesting. But the short of it is that what I've got, by the way, up here is the default for Altium, and I have to admit I like it. But if you want style B, where you've got the X and rather than the exclamation point, you can hit apply, and it will just change the pattern over here. If you're old school and you like the solid colored pattern, you can hit apply again, and you'll get the solid pattern. Or if you just don't like the lime green from the get-go and you're okay with just the markers, then you can say nothing and you can hit apply and you got that. So for me to demonstrate these other ones here, I will go back to style A and I'll hit apply. What these are doing here, what's called the overlay zoom out behavior, is how is this going to look as I zoom out? So for the base pattern scales, literally these things will scale because they'll get smaller and smaller, and I'll have to press OK to demonstrate this. So as I scroll out, you can see that the little exclamation point in the triangle is getting smaller and smaller. In fact, you can't even really tell that there are errors here. But then you zoom in, and voila, you see your errors. Another way to get, by the way, into the preferences is T, which is the shortcut for the tool menu, followed by letter P for preferences, and it brings us back here. The second one I'll show you is the color, the override color dominates. This layer color dominates. I've not been able to get it to work, and I've tried it several times. The theory behind this is that if you zoomed out, the layer color would show above the error markers. Every time I click on this, in fact, if I do it here and I press OK and I zoom out, I'm still going to get the error message, or pardon me, the error color, and then I zoom back in. And if I hit TP again, it just always pushes me down here to override color dominates. And so be it. That's kind of how it seems to be working. But I don't really have too much of a grievance. Hopefully Altium will maybe remedy that at some point, but for my purposes, it works just fine. As for the bottom things here, you can control each one of the rules in terms of the details and the overlay. So if I don't want the overlay, for example, for the clearance because it's too crowded, I can turn it off and I'll press apply, and the only thing it will show me are the little display things. I'm going to cancel this so I can zoom it in to show you a little bit better. So there it is right there. So I do still get the violation information, the display information, but I don't get the pattern. So let's do another TP again here. And of course, if I want to turn off the violation details, I can apply that and those will go away. But since I turned on the overlay pattern, that got turned on. And of course, if I don't want either one of them, I can turn them off as well. So it's another way to do it. But notice it's very specific for each one of these rules. So you set these up for each and every single rule here. So I'm just going to leave both of those on because I'm going to show you a few other features over here. So what other ways can we look at the errors that we've got here? Well, a lot of times, again, we want to figure out what's going on. And fortunately, these overlays do a great job with that. But what are some of the other ways that we can do that? Well, one of them that we can do is we can right-click, and we've got some options here. And one of them is called violations. And the violations is always third from the bottom. I don't know why they put it down so far low, but nevertheless, it's always third from the bottom. If you don't have a violation, you won't see it. So if I click over here in this area here, there are no violations. But if I right-click, there's my violations. It'll tell me each of the violations it shows. And the bottom one says show all violations. I prefer the show all violations because I can look at each one at a time. So if I click on this here, I can see that here's the violation I have between these two pads. If I click on the top one here, I can see the violation between these two particular pads. I can also see what I am violating. And if I need to get into the rule to make an adjustment, I don't have to cancel out and go into the menus to get to design rules. I simply hit clearance here. It's a hyperlink that will bring up that menu. And there it is, and I could make a change there if I wanted to do so. So I'm going to cancel here because I'm not going to change this. The other feature that's really important that you may have noticed, well, there's actually two others I'll show you here. There is the waived violation. This is a relatively new feature. I'll show this one here in just a moment. But two other features to keep in mind. If you're in something that's a really big muddle and you're really trying to figure out, okay, what is this thing really flagging because I see a lot of errors here, two things you can do. The first thing you can do is you can click highlight. And the highlight here, actually, well, let me bring this over here. Can you see it? You may not be able to see this because of the refresh rate of this presentation. But what it will do is it will highlight the two things that are violating with each other. Since this is a binary rule, it needs to show me the two things that are causing the clearance constraint violation. So when I hit highlight, if you did see it, what you see is that it masked out everything else and it showed me that these two pads happen to be in violation. The other thing that works, though, a lot of times we've already zoomed into it, so it may not actually zoom any further. So you can click on jump, and it maybe, in this case it did, it actually will jump you in further, so it'll show you very specifically the area that it is complaining about. So it gives you a little more of a hint as to what's going on. The highlight, I think, is a really great feature because it tells you very specifically what it's complaining about. Now, this new feature they've added in called the waived violations. So if you have a situation, here's my take on this. If you can create a rule that will specifically address that, please do. I think that's a better way of doing it. But if you have situations, and there are certain circumstances in Altium where you just can't get away with the rule, then you can waive the violation. So you turn it on, you can put your name in there if it doesn't know it already, and then you give it a reason. So I'm just gonna say, well, the pads conform to MFG spec. And then I'll press OK. Now notice two things here. The layer pattern changes and the details change. And this is controlled through what we've always called the L key, or what they basically call the view configuration. And Altium 18 and 19, that's now a panel. And what they've added here are two sets of colors. So I've changed the default colors because the colors were really similar to the violations. And for our purposes, I did not want to make it that more confusing. So what I did was I changed them to the pinkish red color here so that you could see the difference between it. So the pattern changed color and the detail changed color. Now, what I also want to show you over here is that if you have a place where there's a lot of violations and you waive it, the pattern may not change. And that's really for a good reason, because what they want to do is make sure that the true violations are still standing out. So if I go here to all violations, let's say I just pick one like this here and I highlight it. So it looks like there's a stub here. Well, it's not really a stub, but it's a part of the trace, and that trace is violating against this particular pad. I'm going to waive this violation and I'm going to press OK. So you'll notice that the pattern did not change. However, the detail here did change here for this specific issue here. So just be aware of that. Okay, the next thing that I would like to do is, since I'm in this area here, is I want to show you the unary and binary rules. It's actually a really cool feature that's been in Altium for quite some time, and a lot of people don't know about it. But what you can do is, and this, by the way, this doesn't have to be a violation. You can even do it on pad 24 here. If you right-click on a primitive, you'll notice something called applicable unary rules and applicable binary rules. And what it will do is it will tell you all the rules that Altium will subscribe to that particular, or probably not subscribe, ascribe to this particular pad or this particular primitive, depending on what you right-clicked and selected here. So this is it for the unary rules. The binary needs an additional piece of information. So if we go into the binary rules, it needs to know which two things we're talking about. Because remember, binary is comparing against two different things. And then I'll show you the scope of each one of those rules, the rules that they have set up, and how those rules are being applied to these two objects here. So a very useful feature as well if you're trying to figure out what's going on with your rules. The last thing I want to show you here is the rules and violations panel that was added in some time ago. But this is a really nice panel because, again, you don't have to keep jumping around to dialogues or even to the design verification report. It's all here within the panel itself. And it is a separate panel. There is something called the PCB panel here. It's not associated with the PCB panel. It is its own panel here, but it looks a lot like the PCB panel in a sense that it breaks things down to the rules, and then it breaks it down to the individual rules. And if there are any violations, it will break it down even further. So I'm going to click on all rules, and I'm going to go, actually, let's go to the clearance constraint. So I only have one specific rule to the clearance constraint here. By the way, I can right-click in here, and they give me some really cool features. So I can go to the properties. So if I want to fix something specific to this rule, I can certainly do that. Notice it doesn't give me access to the other rules at this point. It's only for this clearance rule. One of the other things it can do too is that you can run it. So if I just want to run this specific rule, I can do so. So I just have to right-click on it, and I can run it again. So if you've got something that's got a lot of stuff going on in it, and you just simply wanted to focus on this one rule, this panel is really useful for that type of investigation or debug. Then, of course, all of my different violations, and as I click on them, they zoom me into those accordingly. And of course, we have those things up here that allow us to, whether we want those things selected or if we even want it to zoom, or if we have things that are already selected and we want to clear those, we can do that here. So they've got some features. Notice at the bottom, when you waive something, those don't just get hidden, they don't just disappear, they actually are still managed by Altium. So there they are here in the panel so that they are not forgotten. And then lastly, by the way, if you do rerun under design, and we go into our, under tools, and we go into our design rule check, and we run it one more time, If we have waivers, notice on the right-hand side here, they'll actually show you the waived violations as well. So again, by waiving it, it does not necessarily make it disappear. It just is recognized as a rule that you are allowing to be waived at this point in time. Okay, so with that, what I want to do is I certainly would like to open this up to some questions, but in the meantime, I do have one more polling question for you, so I am going to bring up my PowerPoint slide here. Actually, I've got two of them for you. So let me, the first question I have, and I don't have a PowerPoint for this, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start this one. Let's go over here. And the next one is, I just recently showed you the unary and binary rule feature in Altium, and I'm kind of curious to know if you've used it or if you even knew about it. Great. So interesting, a little over 50% of you now know about it. So that's kind of one of those things that Altium's had in there since Altium 6, and a lot of people just didn't even know it was in there. And that's kind of what happens with Altium. They keep adding really great feature after great feature, and we tend to forget that they're in there because there's just so many features in the tool itself. So before I do get into the questions and a little bit of a discussion about 9.connects itself, I do have one more polling question. This one I will bring up from my current slide here. Just like to know, please rate the materials presentation. I'm kind of curious to see if this is relevant for what you need or not. All right, thank you. So the vast majority of you guys found this relevant for what you need. And for those who had, found some things that in terms of delivery or the material issues, well, hopefully in the next webinar, we'll be able to cover those things that you may have wanted or expected to see in here. So with that being said, actually, I'm going to bring this back here. So I'm going to take a moment here to talk about 9.connects, but in the meantime, if you do have a question, please add them in there into our questions panel, and we will take a look at those here. You are here for a reason today, because you probably wanted to see the newer DRC features that they've added to Altium. They've been adding them in for like the last 10 years and continually adding things in to make it easier or to make it quicker to determine the issues that you have in the tools. You probably want to see the existing and enhanced features of the DRC. So there are things in the DRC that they have enhanced over time. For example, the clearance rule, even the wavering of the waiver thing that they added into the right click of the violations. Or you're brand new to Altium and you just want a better understanding of the DRC, which is a huge aspect of the layout. It really controls a whole lot of things within the layout, and the better that you understand it, the more comfortable you're going to feel with it here. So who are we here at 9.connects? We're a PCB-centric organization. We focus in on training and we focus in on services. The thing I want to talk to you about today is this feature that this tool that, it's not even a tool, it's a training. We have a training called Bootcamp. And we completely redesigned it. So when Altium Designer 18 came out, we said, look, we're going to have to do this a different way because it's different, not only in a tool structure, but we also want to do this because we know people don't just want to push a tool, they want to understand the process of making a design. So it is a project-based course. We take a very specific example of something we've created in the past, which we have actually put onto a board, and we walk you through that particular process. And so who is it for? Well, it can serve for those who are familiar with the tool. So even if you've got a few years under your belt and you learned Altium maybe through some tutorials, you've been learning it on your own as you've been going there, there's a lot more that you can learn. For example, the configuration for templates. This is the one thing we want people to walk away with because it's silly for you to constantly have to build things up from the bottom every single time. Or those features that you may have forgotten or overlooked. Sometimes you do get introduced to a feature and you say that's kind of neat, and then you forget about it because over the course of time you follow a very specific path through your design. Those who teach it are very well versed in PCB design. And the other thing I want to mention here too is that we really do support each other. So when one of us here at 9.connects goes out to give a training and there's a question that comes up that we cannot ask, we send that email to each one of us here within 9.connects so that we can give you an answer. We don't want to just kind of blow it off, because you asked the question for a reason, and we want to make sure that we can get you the appropriate answer that you're looking for. So for more information about this, definitely check us out at 9.connects.com, and then you can see that we have a very specific area for our boot camp, and we also recently created a video here to talk about it a little bit more as well. So with that, I want to thank you very much. Appreciate it, and have a wonderful day.